Hey everyone, Laszlo Montgomery here, and I'm back with this final installment in this three-parter that looks at the life of Morris Two-Gun Cohen, one of the great nobodies of his day. We left off last time with Morris back home in Manchester, looking after his family after his father passed away. By mid-October 1935, Morris headed back to China. The Japanese hadn't invaded yet, but everyone could tell something was in the air. Nothing good was happening as far as China's political situation. The nationalists were still split with competing governments in Nanjing and Guangzhou, and we all remember from past episodes that October 1935 was also the time when Mao Zedong and his surviving comrades finished their long march and began to set up camp in Yan'an. So Morris Cohen arrived back in China just as things were hotting up there. And his benefactor, Chen Chi-tang, well, he's going to lose out against Chiang Kai-shek and ended up having to flee China on July 18, 1936. So he bailed from Chen's organization and once again went back to Sun Ke and his people. That bond was still going strong. He also ended up working for the mayor of Shanghai, Wu Tie-chung. Wu was a longtime follower of Sun Yat-sen and later one of the top KMT officials in post-1949 politics. Morris made himself useful to Wu Tie-chung and, in so doing, was very dialed in to various departments of the Shanghai municipal government. He shuttled regularly between Shanghai, Guangzhou, and Hong Kong during these days. Someone had written of Morris back then, quote, "He was a lively addition to General Wu's frequent and popular luncheons and dinners, and he was otherwise an easy, simple type, seeming to need no visible means of support, but wandering ceaselessly among the foreigners and Chinese of all sorts. One wondered maybe he didn't occasionally report the news to somebody." End quote. So 1935, 1936, I guess you could say Morris peaked right about here. Sure, he had his detractors and he couldn't fool most people, but during this time, Morris Two-Gun Cohen had about as much respectability as he could have possibly hoped for. It was well known and acknowledged by all that he was certainly well connected to a whole bunch of people inside the nationalist government. His association with Sun Yat-sen, Madam Sun, and the Song family was well known, and his connections were real, and the China partners he found for Western business interests almost always panned out like he said. People returned his calls. Morris was a player, mixing with the establishment. He had made it. He was waking up every day in one of the most exciting places in the world. But as the middle of 1937 approached, all this is going to come crashing down on Moish and a lot of others as well. Let me quote something the acting trade commissioner in Hong Kong wrote to a colleague about Morris after he was paid a visit on July 30th, 1936. Quote, "It may interest you to know that General Maurice Cohen, quote, Two-Gun Cohen, called this morning and discussed the situation in Guangdong. In the course of the interview, he told me confidentially that the central government was considering stimulating British interest in South China so that, in time, it should develop into and be regarded by the British government as a sphere of British influence. Such an idea savors of the Victorian era and the partition of the melon, and Cohen's record, which is doubtless well known to the embassy, does not inspire confidence. Nevertheless, he is closely in touch with Chinese official circles, and there may be something in what he says." End quote. July 7th, 1937, the Marco Polo Bridge incident happened. Morris was in Shanghai when that incident went down. He was still on Wu Tie-chung's payroll. Wu had been made the governor of Guangdong, and Morris followed him down there after things began to get real hairy in Shanghai. November 12th, Shanghai fell. Next stop for the Japanese army was Nanjing. Amidst all this chaos that the year 1937 always evokes in China, Morris didn't really go out of his way to let his family know he was alive and well. The news of the savagery being committed in China by the Japanese military made its way back to the UK, so they had to wait this one out and pray for news one way or the other. Morris rode out the storm like everyone else did and returned to Manchester upon hearing about the death of his sister Jane, who passed away in Rhodesia. It was a sad time for the Cohen family. It was doubly sad for Morris because not only did he lose a loved one, but His nice little China world was starting to fall apart right in front of his eyes. When Morris Cohen went back to China, he resumed work as a fixer for Wu Tie-chung, and as he always would, he stayed close with the Songs and looked after Song Ching-ling and always showed genuine concern for her well-being. And any time a journalist asked him, well, he made himself sort of a non-appointed spokesman who never missed a chance to get on a soapbox and popularize China's plight in 1938. By year's end, Morris vacated the premises along with the Guangzhou government and headed west to Chongqing. And with Wu Tie-chung's appointment as Minister of Overseas Chinese Affairs and of KMT Affairs in Hong Kong and Macau, Morris's continued employment was assured. During this early period when the KMT was setting itself up in Chongqing, Morris made a trip to Hong Kong to handle something on behalf of Wu Tie-chung. Among other things, Morris also saw to the rental of an apartment on the Peak for Song Ching-ling to stay in, far from the bombing going on in Chongqing. Whilst in Hong Kong, Morris drove Madam Sun around and ran errands for her, always packing 2 guns for her protection. Morris continued to be a high-profile figure, always holding court at the Hong Kong hotel. Someone wrote about Morris Cohen from those days, quote, "The general was playing his role of picturesque old China hand those days. He would sit in the lobby of the Grips day after day, slightly drunk, cheerfully ready to fasten on anyone who came by. He didn't have many troubles. Madam Sun paid him a pension, and he played a lot of poker, usually with Wu Tie-chung, and dabbled in various real estate deals and so on, just for the fun of it. It was sort of a hazard getting through the Grips lobby around noon. If you didn't run into General Cohen, you were apt to fall in with one-armed Sutton. I used to see him most Sunday nights in the Grips. He would sit at the table, and he'd have a few drinks. He was living on his reminiscences by the time I met him." End quote. Others said of Morris Cohen from this period, quote, "In Hong Kong, I played poker with him and lost money. He was there, and he was showing card tricks. I think when he played with his friends, he was completely honest. He had a good sense of humor and was a first-class bastard. He was a very active and a very jolly one. He made people fond of him. We all knew he was a character, somewhat of a rogue with a somewhat unsavory past. It somehow didn't come through at all. Everybody was very fond of him. Morris was there right in the middle of everything and very much part of it. Very jolly, very benign, a very kind friend. He used to be very fond of children. He was very entertaining, showing card tricks. I mean, he could deal himself a full house quite easily without anyone knowing anything about it." End quote. Part of Morris's shtick when people would make him out to be the big deal that he liked to be seen as was to respond, "Hey, I'm just a Yiddish boy from the Edmonton Irish Brigade." September 1939, the Germans invaded Poland, and now World War II was in full swing. Wu Tie-chung hit the road, traveling around Southeast Asia, trying to raise money and support for the China Relief Fund. Morris accompanied him and got to travel in style, the only way he liked it. Because he was so close to the center, Morris got the chance to hobnob with all the diplomats and big shots wherever they went, Philippines, East Indies, and Malaya. By the spring of 1941, Morris was back in Chongqing. Well, the second half of 1941, how to describe those days? It was rough for everyone. Chongqing was getting slammed mercilessly, and as December rolled near, everyone knew Japan was going to make a grab for Hong Kong. Morris was there when it happened, all the time trying to get Song Ching-ling to flee to safety, but she refused to leave all the way up until the final moment. Even she knew she was no use to anyone except the Japanese if they captured her. Morris was part of the gang that got Madam Sun out in the end. So when the bombs began raining down on the inhabitants of Hong Kong, Morris Abraham Cohen was there too. He got caught up in the whole ugly mess. And when the roof caved in on December 7th, 1941, a day that lives in infamy in more places than the USA, 54-year-old Morris Cohen lost everything. When he was rounded up by the Japanese, his only possessions were the clothes on his back and whatever he had in his pockets to give him warmth in the chilly December Hong Kong climes, he was thankful to still have a silk-padded coat that had been a gift from no less a personage than H.H. Cohen himself. After Hong Kong fell, the foreigners were rounded up and went through a sorting period that had everyone packed into makeshift holding centers and hotels. Finally, Morris and 2,325 British, 290 Americans, 60 Dutch ended up in the notorious Stanley internment camp. Morris occupied Block 16 of the compound that housed 93 men and 26 women. The first 6 months were horrific, and everyone slept on the cold floors and went to bed hungry every night. The Kempeitai, Japan's version of the Gestapo, they had a thick file on Morris and knew he was real tight with all the big KMT leaders. They put him through the ringer a whole bunch of times and knocked him around, trying to get information out of Morris. It had been a while since Morris had to take his lumps like this, but going back to his days on the streets of the Whitechapel district and on the Canadian Plain, not to mention Rodzinov during his childhood, Morris knew how to take a punch. So 1941, 1942, and into 1943, Morris endured the humiliating and dismal life of a prisoner of war. He wasn't the only one to get it. Japanese cruelty and deprivation was dished out to all the Western prisoners. During this period, Morris suffered from a number of maladies, same as everyone else in his situation. He lost 80 pounds and endured the same miserable daily hunger these internment camps were famous for. Despite the hardships, someone later wrote of Morris Cohen during this period, quote, "He wasn't one of the chaps who were saying, 'Look how hard up I am and how miserable I am.' He was always a cheerful sight, always a friendly word, gregarious. He would always make you laugh." End quote. Morris caught a break when, because of his Canadian citizenship, he was able to get on a list for a prisoner exchange. This was in February 1943. By September of that year, Morris was once again a free man, back in the Great White North. By December, he began a new phase in his life. This was his Montreal period. That's where he ended up after his release from Stanley Prison. When he arrived, the press was there to greet him and get his account of everything going on in China and with his time as a prisoner of war. Of course, Morris knew how to handle this kind of thing. And Morris, being Morris, checked himself into the Windsor Hotel, the grandest hotel of its day. The NHL had been formed there only 26 years before. A steady stream of journalists, local officials, and prominent members of Montreal's Jewish community came to call on Morris Cohen. The Canadian Jewish Congress threw a big bash for Morris that was officiated by Samuel Bronfman himself. Morris and Samuel Bronfman were 2 years apart in age, and both had been kicked out of their birthplaces due to the pogroms. And one other little fact, they both lived in Wapella at one time or another. At this shindig that the Montreal Jewish community threw for Morris, 500 people showed up to honor him. And 57-year-old Morris got to stand before everyone at the banquet hall, a great success and a major macher in the world of Chinese business and diplomacy. He got to tell his story and spoke of his humble Jewish origins, his hardships, failures, and how he came to Canada. It was no doubt quite a redeeming moment after all he had gone through since 1922. Morris came out and said the words you'd probably never expect to hear. In a sign that maybe the war had changed him, he said, quote, "I can tell you simply that I'm very happy to be alive and out of the Stanley internment camp at Hong Kong. One thing I wish to make clear, I'm not a big shot. People here have made a fuss over me, and I don't know why. It's true I was appointed a Major General by the government of China. It's also true that I am a friend of China. But really, I'm the same Morris Cohen who came to Canada as a Jewish immigrant when I was 16. Most of the things that have been written about me were much exaggerated." End quote. Yeah, Morris always knew how to lay it on thick, no matter in his grossest exaggerations or deepest humility. So it was quite a homecoming for Morris Cohen, and he stayed in Montreal for a while and got back into shape. It was quite an ordeal that he went through, and now his fortunes were quite different. Where to go from here? You'd think he'd be highly in demand for his consulting services. But the phone calls didn't come as fast as Morris thought they would. Basically, despite everything that Morris had been able to accomplish, a lot of people still didn't take him too seriously. His reputation and his shady past sort of made him someone that a lot of people instinctively didn't trust. So the Montreal years immediately after his hero's welcome were not starting off well for Morris. Morris went and got himself hitched. He married a woman named Ida Judith Clark. Ida's friend said of her new husband, quote, "He wasn't a good-looking man, an odd-looking man, but a charming smile and blazing green eyes. He had penetrating eyes and a very warm, hearty laugh. Somehow there was something about his personality. When he spoke, you listened, even though his English was abominable at times. He would capture attention." End quote. The wedding was quite the event in Montreal. They toured Canada, and Morris was given a warm reception wherever he went. It was quite a sensation whenever Morris came to town, and wherever Morris went, he was a hardcore supporter of Chiang Kai-shek and the nationalist government, always talking them up and trying to raise money or political support for them. When Morris mixed with the local Chinese, he was treated with deference. Someone who accompanied Morris to Chinatown once wrote, quote, "He was lionized here at first. When he took me into a restaurant, especially a Chinese down in Chinatown, oh my God, they didn't know what to do first. They bowed and kowtowed and served him like a king of England." End quote. So this was a good time, but it wasn't to last. For a while, Morris got to mix with the cream of Montreal society. He was a big fish in a small pond for a moment, but Morris was running low on the one thing that keeps you at the top, and that was money. He might have been comped wherever he went, but that didn't fill his checking account. So Morris had to go out and look for work. At his age, it wasn't looking good to be entering the job market. He had a very unique skill set, and it wasn't like there were jobs that could use a guy his age and with his particular experience. So he began to live off his wife pretty quickly. She had a nice women's clothing boutique that brought in an honest income, and for all of 1944 and 1945, Morris was trying to get something going, but Judith was the one who brought home the bacon every night. Around this time, when the Zionist movement was really ramping up, some organizations approached Morris and essentially asked him to lobby his contacts in China. They asked Morris to convince his well-placed friends in the nationalist government to not vote against any UN resolution that might call for a new state of Israel. They had checked Morris out to see if he was the real deal. One of these people later wrote, quote, "One day I was walking down the street with him to take him out for dinner, and 3 other people were walking down the street. Ambassador Wellington Koo, the Chinese ambassador to the United States, a highly polished and sophisticated gentleman, and H.H. Kong and T.V. Song. And by God, the first thing I know is they embraced the man. So this business of knowing them wasn't any put on." End quote. Morris worked tirelessly to bring together Zionist interests and Chinese diplomats. He proved himself useful to them and played his small part in the creation of the State of Israel. After the war, Morris was itching to get back to China, and in January 1946, he was back for the first time since he left in 1941. En route, he made another one of his random visits to see his family in Manchester. And when he hit town in Shanghai, Morris started working the lobbies like the old days, looking to get in on any deals where there was a possible opening for him. And there he hooked up again with Wu Tie-chung and did his best to get in on any big-ticket infrastructural projects. He also remained close to the Songs and still served Madame Sun whenever she called upon him. Morris was able to drum up enough commissions to keep his ship afloat. As 1946 transitioned to 1947, Morris was stable once again. In early 1947, he came to the aid of someone in the Tianjin Jewish community. They had offered to pay Morris a couple $100,000 if he'd use his influence to get one of their friends off the hook who had been arrested by the China local authorities on some charges. And Morris got the guy set free, but This group in Tianjin, well, they ended up stiffing Morris, and he chased this big chunk of change for the rest of his days without success. But a lot of the time, Morris's connections and abilities to get things done in China weren't what they used to be. 1947 wasn't the same as those days before 1937. It was a whole new world in China, and the times they were a-changin'. It wasn't an environment that Morris could thrive in, not at his age anyways. Morris went back to Canada and tried his luck in Ottawa. Someone wrote of that time, quote, "We talked about his colorful career as a bodyguard to Sun Yat-sen and also his later, more questionable life as an arms agent with the various warlords in China. He told a very good story with many expletives. For a young officer, this was a real romance. He liked to live well, and he liked to get as close as he could to the seats of power. Morris was a great name-dropper to indicate the influence he had with certain people and routes to get things done. But I don't think he ever got his hands on any big deal that I ever heard of. I don't think anyone would have trusted him. He was a person of great interest because of his previous role in China and his name-dropping and the color that he could add to what was often a rather dull day at the office." End quote. Morris, for all these years, had been saying that he was going to write a memoir, but he could never even begin to get organized. Feeling he was no longer a player, he picked up and went to China in September 1947 to try and get back in the game. But nothing panned out, and he was back in Montreal the following year. During that period, one of the people who socialized with Morris and Judith Cohen said, quote, "We went out a lot together. Morris used to take us to the Chinese restaurants that he knew about. He knew everyone in the Chinese section of town. We used to go to Chinatown with him and just walk into any restaurant, and it was like he owned the restaurant. It didn't matter how crowded they were. He always presented a grandiose figure with his spats and his bowler hat and his cane. He got this kind of respect from people. They would just bring food that nobody ever heard of." End quote. Morris tried to trade on his name, but despite all the honor and recognition, nothing was panning out, and he was back living off his wife Judith again. After October 1949, everyone in China split up. Song Qingling and Li Jishun stayed in China. Wu Tiecheng and Chen Jitang went to Taiwan. TV Song, H.H. Kong, and Sun Ke all went to the West. It was over for Morris Cohen in China. Now it was the PRC, and in the new political environment, there was no room for characters like Morris Cohen. His marriage, with Morris gone constantly, predictably suffered, and with Morris down on his luck and everything he was trying ending in failure, his life was soon reduced to relative poverty. He was borrowing money from everybody he knew and even reducing himself to get Judith to borrow money on his behalf. The early 1950s wasn't a good time for Morris. He was drunk all the time and difficult to be around. His marriage ended, and Morris left Canada for good and headed back to England. He moved in with his sister Leah. All those many past years when Morris would come to Manchester to visit his family, laden with gifts, he shared his success with everyone. Now he was back and had essentially nothing. The Chinese in England who knew Morris passed the hat and didn't allow their old friend to slide too far. In June of 1952, Morris took a trip to Taiwan, did his usual hang out in the lobby routine, and tried to get something going. A New York Times writer from that time mentioned about running into Morris, quote, "I saw him practically every day. He would just hang around the lobby. I got tired of listening to his stories. In fact, he was a goddamn pest. He was always the hero of these stories. To hear him talk, he was responsible for the whole Sun Yat-sen revolution. So far as I could make out, he had a minor role in the whole thing. He was just a .38 caliber bore. I certainly didn't socialize with him. I had to endure his stories, and endure is the word. I could not avoid him." End quote. As he began to get himself set up in Manchester, Morris tried to launch all kinds of merchandising endeavors, all with some sort of China angle, but he didn't know what he was doing and nothing ever came of anything. And besides, he had no idea how to run a company. And just as the portcullis were about to come crashing down on his hopes, his biography hit the shelves. He finally did manage to tell his story to a longtime acquaintance, Charles Drage, who wrote The Life and Times of General Two-Gun Cohen. I saw it listed on Amazon for $550, used in hardcover. If you couldn't personally sit in a smoke-filled hotel lobby with Morris Cohen and listen to all his tall tales and stories going back to the beginning, this book was the next best thing. It was a long and rambling account of Morris's life as told by Morris himself. Therefore, the whole book itself is suspect. In Daniel S. Levy's definitive work on Morris Cohen's life, Two-Gun Cohen, a biography, he debunked plenty of the claims made in Drage's book. People started to poke around, and word got out that Drage's book was mostly fiction. Nonetheless, Morris went on tour to promote the book, and it was like the past 5 years it never happened. He was back. Around this time, Morris, self-importantly, started to get the word out that if the opposing governments in Beijing and Taiwan needed his services to bring about reconciliation and reunification, he was ready to help. One American diplomat in London who had an encounter with Morris said, quote, "His present address is the Mayfair in the West End of London, a far from inexpensive hotel near Piccadilly. There seems to be little question, however, that he is in financial straits and that he hopes, through his visit to Beijing, to redress his fortunes. He seems to feel that he continues to enjoy the goodwill of Madame Sun Yat-sen, and perhaps he does, although he is said to still be a member of the Kuomintang. He claims to have friends on the mainland as well as Formosa, and to have refused to identify himself with one side or the other. He professes that his objective is to serve China by promoting an understanding between Beijing and Taipei. Conceivably, he would be willing to work for both capitals." End quote. Song Ching-ling put in a good word for Morris and got him invited to the 1955 National Day celebration in Beijing. The Chinese government picked up the tab. A couple months after the celebration, Morris had his big homecoming in Hong Kong. And then a funny thing happened. Morris used his ways to talk himself back into China. He crossed the Hong Kong-Shenzhen border, and then these rumors began to fly. Morris was just going back to China after his Hong Kong visit to see Song Ching-ling, but somehow a rumor got out that caught fire that said the real purpose of his secret visit to China was to unify China and Taiwan. So Morris became an overnight sensation, and there was all this buzz in the air that this old guy, with friends in high places in the KMT and CCP, was making a secret visit to China and had the blessing of the KMT to speak on their behalf. Well, this created quite a storm in Taipei. The nationalists totally disavowed everything Morris said. They said they had nothing to do with him whatsoever, and he didn't speak for them. And who is this guy? The whole thing was a circus, and Two-Gun Cohen made quite a sensation in the Chinese press. And he, of course, knew how to milk this for all it was worth. He stayed in China until March 20th, 1956. The Chinese rolled out the red carpet for him, and from that point forward, Morris Cohen became what the Soviets called a useful idiot, and played the role of the poster boy apologist for China. He couldn't speak glowingly enough about all the great things going on in the mainland. This, predictably, got him blacklisted in Taiwan, and at that point, they turned their back on Morris. And with the Red Scare going at a furious boil, Morris also became persona non grata in the U.S. as well. Because of his past association with Sun Yat-sen, Morris was invited to China in April 1956 for Sun's 90th birthday anniversary. Morris, as before, had all his expenses paid for by the PRC government, and they milked his visit for whatever propaganda value they could get out of it. And like his previous visit, with the Chinese picking up the tab for everything, Morris sort of overstayed his welcome, and after a while they had to show him the exit. Nicely, of course. It's said on this trip, Morris kept trying to get FaceTime with Zhou Enlai in order to assure him of his effectiveness as a conduit for trade with the West. And then he went back to England, staying at his sister Leah's place on Broughton Lane in Salford, outside Manchester. There, he resumed his role as paterfamilias in the extended Cohen family, And all the time, whenever they assembled and had their wall-to-wall chopped liver family get-togethers, Morris would do that thing he loved to do the most. He'd sit with his nieces, nephews, cousins, and everyone and just regale them with the stories of his life in the Orient. Sidney Rittenberg, who we featured in CHP episode 99, ran into Morris in the Beijing hotel lobby during one of these trips. He recalled, quote, "He would be there, very visible, a portly, affable-looking gentleman with a big cigar and all the trimmings. He looked like he might be a traveling salesman who just dropped into town. He was a good storyteller. He would fasten you with his eye in a very genial manner. He knew just how much detail to go into without losing you or boring you. He was one of these people who's a very obvious sort of a faker, sort of a bluffer, and yet you never felt that there was the slightest bit of malice in him. He would tell all these tales and he would swagger, but you always felt that he was a very decent man." End quote. Morris came back to Beijing again in September 1957 for another National Day celebration. He kept up the fight and tried to keep an income stream going, but at the age of 70, he was as broke as he ever was. When his ex-wife fell on hard times herself, after all she had done for Morris when he had hit the skids, he couldn't even do anything for her. But it wasn't over for Morris Cohen. You'd think this would be the end, but just as Morris was starting to sink beneath the waves, Rolls-Royce hired him as a consultant to help them sell engines. It turned out to be the perfect job for him, and this led to other consultancies for Morris. In May of 1960, he appeared on the Canadian version of What's My Line, called Front Page Challenge, an old TV show that ran from 1957 to 1995. I think there's a link for the show still on YouTube where you could see this and get a chance to see and hear Morris in action. You could hear his Polish, British, Canadian blended accent. In January of 1962, 75-year-old Morris Cohen met with 64-year-old Golda Meir in Hong Kong. There, Morris assured the Prime Minister he would do everything he could to lobby his contacts in China to get Israel recognition from the PRC. In the end, though, he couldn't do anything for Golda Meir. Morris was always a tireless supporter of China and always spouted the party line. Even during the Great Leap Forward, Morris was still waving his pom-poms the whole time. During these years, Morris was comfortable once again. When he wasn't at home in Salford, he would set himself up at the Park Lane in London and still tried to stay in the game, getting a piece of whatever deal came within his reach. He kept on working for Rolls-Royce, who were very kind and generous to Morris. That job paid all the bills and allowed Morris to live in a style that he was most accustomed to. In the middle of the Cultural Revolution, Morris was invited back to China again for Sun Yat-sen's 100th birthday anniversary. On this visit, Morris was able to get into a group photograph with all the top leaders, including Chairman Mao. During the banquet, Premier Zhou Enlai himself walked to his table and personally toasted Morris Cohen, saying, quote, "Morris, old friend, long life," end quote. Well, Morris would still work the lobbies wherever and whenever he could, but by 1967, already 80 years old, his health was beginning to decline. From that point forward, Morris Cohen was either resting at his sister Leia's with a King Edward cigar in one hand and a black coffee in another, and a stack of newspapers at his side, or he was in and out of hospitals. Biographer Daniel S. Levy, again, who has written the definitive biography of Two Gun Cohen, summed up Morris Cohen's life better than I ever could, so let me just quote from his book. Quote, "He had little else to do except reflect on his improbable life. Despite the myth that he spent years nurturing, Cohen was not a force in Chinese politics, finance, or the military, nor was he a grand strategist or a political philosopher. His early years and predilections almost seemed to destine him for a life of crime. He ran with petty villains and could have easily graduated to being an enforcer, a rum runner, or holding some position within a large urban mob. He was never entirely to escape his shady past, his darker side as a gambler and a charlatan, yet his makeup was thankfully tempered by an essentially generous soul. By chance or luck, he fell in with a group of Chinese who, while engaging in the sort of nefarious practices that he gravitated to, also yearned for an overthrow of the imperial order in their homeland. End quote. Morris Cohen died in September of 1970. He's buried in Blakely Jewish Cemetery in Manchester. Officials from both governments in Beijing and Taipei attended the funeral. A year later, on September 12, 1971, a headstone was placed in front of the monument that read, "This is the tomb of Ma Kun, inscribed by Song Cheng-ling, Vice Chairman of the People's Republic of China." Back in 2011, it was announced that Doug Liman was going to direct a Hollywood movie about Morris Two Gun Cohen. He was teaming up with the great Rob Reiner and Alan Greisman. Beijing Galloping Horse Film and TV Production Company was putting up the money. Doug Liman was the guy who directed all the Jason Bourne movies with Matt Damon. I read Doug Liman dropped out of the picture, and I'm not sure where the Hollywood version of the life of Morris Cohen is right now. I believe Beijing Galloping Horse, for a time, was looking for a new Hollywood partner to work with. I'd go see that movie. I hope it gets made one day. There was also a 1936 movie called The General Died at Dawn. It starred Gary Cooper, who played this mercenary named O'Hara. And the movie takes place in China, and Gary Cooper's character is sort of based on Morris Cohen. I've never seen the film. And that's going to be it from me. Hope y'all enjoyed this series. He wasn't anyone important, but he was one of the characters of the times, and I thought his life was worth introducing in the CHP. If this series on Morris Two Gun Cohen was of any interest to you, you may want to go check out my two-parter on William Mesny. That was CHP 177 and 78. He was a 19th century Moishe who tried to carve out his destiny in Guizhou province. So, you might like that. Okay, Laszlo Montgomery here, signing off from Los Angeles, California. Take care, everyone, and I hope you'll join me next time for another exciting episode of the China History Podcast.